Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. C. 951, Beginning of the War. Chapter 951, Beginning of the War. Fu Xietain and the others left their half-finished dinner and quickly followed him to confront the enemy. As they moved towards the east wall, Xietain could not help but notice some tension in the air, and when he looked back he saw that some of his subordinates had dark faces. He turned his face to the front and as he calmly walked forward inquired, "Scared? Scared?" Nangong muttered upon hearing Xietan's question. Nangong Lingxin forced a smile and said with some bitterness, "Xietain, it's not that we are scared, but it's just that after fighting for months with goblins you come to respect them a little. Among them, there are some really powerful soul evolvers, and their numbers just don't make any sense. Even third-order soul evolvers like us could end up dying at the hands of apparently endless seas of unclassified goblins. Respect? For the goblins?" Xietain snorted. What he had seen today was more than enough for the word respect to have little or nothing to do with that filthy race. They're just a bunch of useless scum, they don't deserve respect from anyone, let alone a member of my faction, he stated. Nangong Lingxin's words seemed to touch a nerve as he said coldly, "If any of you are scared, then return to the villa." "Hey, I just said none of us are scared, didn't you hear me? If we were fearful, then do you think we would have the level we have despite facing mostly high-level enemies?" Nangong Lingxin frowned, not understanding why a couple of words would upset the young man in front of her this much. "Then less talking and more killing goblins," Xietain said. His eyes glinted slightly in the middle of the dark night as he said coldly, "You guys just need to fight like you always do, I'll do the rest." Seeing that their leader was in a clearly bad mood, no one said anything else. Although Nangong Lingxin's mood soured slightly, this was not enough to affect her mind, so she too focused on the war to come. In reality, Xietain kept what he had seen today hidden before they arrived at the goblin base. He didn't think it was necessary to disturb the hearts of those who followed him and let them be burdened with something so horrible, therefore, he kept it to himself. However, this also ended up causing Xietain to feel practically irrational hatred and anger towards the goblin race in the eyes of others. As they reached the east wall, the roars and growls of goblins and sea creatures could be heard from the distance. The ground trembled slightly as well, and although the darkness was almost completely overwhelming, the sparse starlight served to enable everyone to see on the distant horizon a large black spot approaching them. "They'll probably be here in 10 minutes at the most," Evangeline pointed out before looking at Xietain. "What should we do?" Xietain looked at the soul evolvers of his faction who had already formed a wall in front of the base gate. Looking further to his sides, he saw dozens of soldiers near each goblin magic cannon waiting to fire while others were taking position to fire their weapons when the order came. Xietain also noticed that there were large trenches almost the size of craters everywhere between them and the enemies, and since they were clearly just formed, it didn't take him long to realize that some soul evolvers had taken the trouble to create obstacles for their enemies. Looking straight ahead, Xietain said casually, "You all just fight the way you always do without worrying about anything." Despite the doubts they felt in their hearts, they all nodded silently and leaped forward. In a matter of seconds, Nangong Lingxin, Fu Xietain, Evangeline, Luoning, Xiao Xiao, and Bai Zhilin positioned themselves on the front lines waiting for the enemy. Each of them distanced themselves more than 1,000 meters from each other to take full advantage of the power that, being third-order or peak second-order soul evolvers, guaranteed them. Even assassins focused on agility, as was the case with Evangeline and Fu Xietain, were terrifying when it came to attacking, regardless of whether or not the amount of destruction they could cause or the number of enemies they could kill per attack at the same time was or was not comparable to that of a mage or a powerful warrior. Xietain walked to the edge of the wall and looked straight ahead with an indifferent expression as he waited for the enemy to arrive. A few steps behind him, Xian Mayer was looking towards the horizon with her arms crossed under her bust before looking at Xietan's back. "You're not planning to join them, are you?" she asked in a melodious voice, worthy of a siren. "What about you?" Xietain asked back. He looked over his shoulder back and his eyes lingered for a moment on the two female Tritons standing on either side behind Xietain before calmly saying, "You have no plans to help? I want to see how much you've grown in this time." Xietain replied. Her blue eyes met his red eyes as she calmly said, "I don't understand how you could still be in the First Order, human leader Xietain." Xietain closed his eyes and finally understood what was going on. He opened them again and looked straight ahead as he nodded, "I see. Well, don't freak out too much, Princess Mermaid." The two female Tritons beside Xietain grimaced as they heard the words of the human in front of them. Had it not been for the fact that the man in front of them had apparently taken down the mother fortress of the goblin race almost single-handedly, neither of them would have stayed silent. To put it bluntly, they both felt a certain contempt in their hearts. At the end of the day, they could feel the aura of a first-order soul evolver on the body of the human in front of them. Just in case, it's not that I feel disdain towards you at all, but I think you understand my position. Xietain clarified after a moment of silence. Xietain simply smiled in response without agreeing or disagreeing with her words. Xietain was certainly powerful. She was somewhere around the level 150 at the moment. Moreover, considering how pure her soul power was, she would probably have no problem fighting against peak Third Order soul evolvers. It was normal for her to doubt Xietan's strength upon sensing him at level 50, but Xietain was not bothered by this. At the end of the day, he was already used to receiving weird glances. Besides, none of those weird glances lasted long after he stepped forward on the battlefield, so it didn't matter. Just as Xietain had said, her position was difficult. Therefore, Xietain understood her hesitation. Soon, the enemies broke into a range of 500 meters, and at this point, everyone could clearly see the smiling and ugly faces of the goblins as well as the fierce faces of the sea creatures that were staring at them with bloodshot eyes. It was at that point that the human soldiers raised their weapons and began to shoot fiercely. However, these soldiers were not using normal weapons. Sky blue laser beams flew from the east wall, numbering in the thousands, breaking all natural resistance and turning a few thousands of goblins and sea beasts into sieves in a second. Some of them did not die immediately, but they certainly suffered as they began to writhe in pain after losing limbs or being severely wounded from getting shot in the upper part of their body. Xietan's eyes flashed slightly at the sight of the power of the electromagnetic rifles. During his period of absence, the number of electromagnetic rifles available in his faction had almost quintupled, now amounting to more than 60,000 of them. Additionally, due to the circumstances, half of those 60,000 electromagnetic rifles were in the hands of the army located in Inner Mongolia. Don't fire the goblin magic cannons. Use the electromagnetic rifles and normal ammunition to shoot. If you consume the soul stone of your electromagnetic rifle, don't hesitate to use the ones you have in reserve. As ammunition, after leveling up 5 levels, switch the rifle with the squad mates next to you and take a normal weapon instead. Xietan's voice spread practically all over the wall, and even though some hesitated, everyone followed his orders in the end. At this point, even the lowest level soldier was a level 10 soul evolver. Thanks to constant training, they all now had great marksmanship, so they naturally began to gain experience after taking the life of an enemy by relying not on luck but on their own ability. In addition, the soldiers with military training had a great experience in physical combat, so they were certainly capable of fighting enemies of higher levels than them. Xietain looked up at the sky when a giant shadow rose above them. It didn't take long for him to realize that the giant shadow turned out to be the combination of countless bone arrows enveloped by mana and magic flying towards his army. Just at that moment, a huge multicolored barrier stretched more than 10 kilometers separating the sky and the earth in two. Moments later, what seemed to be millions of arrows slammed into the barrier, fiercely causing explosions that reverberated in the middle of the night. Regardless of the number of arrows and the power that each arrow contributed to the collective attack, the barrier didn't even flinch at all, forget about being damaged. There was not even a casualty on the human side despite the enemy's large-scale attack. Bai Zemin looked at Nangong Lingxin's slender back and his eyes glistened slightly. She had become tremendously more powerful compared to the Nangong Lingxin from 6 months ago. Her past self certainly wouldn't have been able to do something like this with such apparent ease. Magic skills of all kinds were activated one after another, and soon the battlefield was brilliantly illuminated, under the radiance of tens of thousands of fireballs, lightning arrows, luminous water spears, and light swords. Even though it was nighttime, the sky seemed to descend over the entire area, as everyone could clearly see the faces of their enemies even from a distance. Explosions accompanied by shrieks and roars capable of sending shivers down the spine of even the bravest broke the natural nighttime peace as thousands of liters of green, purple, and blue blood joined together to form what resembled a tricolored blanket on the ground, slowly filling the many craters formed before and during the battle to give birth to gloomy pools of warm blood. Despite their clearly overwhelming numbers, the goblins and sea beasts that attacked were all unclassified and first-order stocks. In fact, 99% of them were soul evolvers that had not even reached level 25, so they were no different from cannon fodder in the eyes of the transcendent faction's soul evolvers. Fu Xiefeng's body was enveloped by a succession of blue and red lightning that crackled noisily around him as if announcing his arrival. Wherever he went, at least 100 enemies fell with a slit in their throats or a hole in their hearts. However, none of the enemies he killed bled, as the flesh wounds were scorched by the lightning rays that enveloped his dagger. Evangeline was a lot scarier than him, even though she wasn't as flashy. Her lithe body allowed her to slip into the enemy ranks with surprising ease, and for every second that passed, there were about 1,000 goblins or sea creatures falling lifeless. Her waist swayed like that of a water snake, dodging attacks without even receiving a scratch as the black dagger in her right hand became the Reaper's scythe that sent shivers down the spines of her foes. What skill is that? Bai Zemin muttered as he rubbed his chin with his eyes focused on Nangong Yi. Nangong Yi was undoubtedly the most eye-catching on the battlefield, at least to the naked eye. His body had risen to over 4 meters tall, but the current Nangong Yi no longer looked like a human. His entire skin was covered with a thick layer of shiny scales, and every time a magic attack hit him it simply bounced off and turned the goblin or sea beast that launched it into its new target. A 6-meter-long tail swung like a whip behind him, turning hundreds of enemies into meat paste with each swing. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. C. 952, Never-Ending Enemies. Chapter 952, Never-Ending Enemies. Nangong Yi's claws and tail made him the most vicious of them all, to the point that 30 minutes later he had to take the initiative to pursue enemies as the goblins and sea creatures seemed to be avoiding him. Bai Zemin frowned as he remembered that Nangong Yi had the dragon transformation skill. But if he remembered correctly, that skill had already reached its peak and the scales definitely didn't shine like diamonds. He would have to ask him later what was going on. When Bai Zemin looked at the little pink-haired beauty standing in the middle of the battlefield surrounded by enemies but firm and graceful like a goddess, his eyes lit up slightly. Xiao Xiao was surrounded by 4 whirlwinds of water rising up to the sky. All enemies who came near her were sent flying into the eye of the storm and turned into a pile of bloody mist. At the same time, the water droplets that were released from the 4 whirlwinds due to the high rotation speed turned into countless sharp darts that took the lives of up to many thousands in a matter of seconds. Is that Watermaker? Bai Zemin asked as he looked at Xiao Xiao in surprise. It is. Xian Meier nodded as she took a step forward and stopped beside him. Her eyes looked at Xiao Xiao tenderly and she said softly, Xiao Xiao is a genius among geniuses. She is the only creature of our sea race that does not lose any part of her power regardless of whether she is in the ocean or on land. Another benefit is that being her allies we do not weaken either for as long as we stay close to Xiao Xiao. Bai Zemin nodded with a thoughtful expression on his face. Soon, however, his attention turned to Luo Ning and he got another surprise when he saw the girl surrounded by what seemed to be at least 1,000 black tigers. However, he knew that these black tigers were actually large black cats. at the same time as Luo Ning bravely wielded a sword that was even bigger than her. The shadow cats used the shadows of the enemies to assault them from behind or from the sides, wiping out more than 2,000 enemies per passing second. Just like everyone else, Luo Ning had grown enormously, and Bai Zemin knew that she would grow even more in the future. She was destined to become a great existence someday. After all, Luo Ning had started to evolve from an early age, even risking her life on multiple occasions. On the other hand, the least conspicuous but most terrifying of all, human leader Bai Zemin, is that girl really your daughter? Xian Meier asked as she looked at Bai Shilin with strange eyes. My records are in her soul, so even though she was not born by conventional means, you can consider her my daughter. Bai Zemin replied. Bai Shilin was truly terrifying, to say the least. She was like an invisible hurricane of wind that her enemies could not see or touch. Bai Shilin seemed to disappear every so often due to her high agility in combination with each stomp powered by over 2,500 strength points, appearing only briefly before disappearing again after deciding on a new location to attack. Everyone, regardless of whether it was unclassified or first order, regardless of whether it was a small green goblin or whether it was a large 3-meter-tall shark, all of them had their heads exploded into flesh paste without even knowing how they had died. Only Bai Zemin and Xian Meier, who were following Bai Shilin's movements, could tell that the cause of such a disaster was her little white fist. Moreover, Bai Shilin was slowly getting used to launching physical and magical attacks at the same time as there were hundreds of ice swords dancing around her, chopping enemies at lightning speed. She's killing at least 3,000 for every passing second, said one of the female tritons behind Xian Meier in astonishment. And she's not even punching the ground to cause more devastating attacks. Otherwise, that number would be much higher. Pointed out the other. They're all holding back to save mana and stamina. There's no need to use big attacks against this kind of enemy. Let's see how long they can keep it up. Xian Meier shook her head, to which Bai Zemin nodded without saying a word. The number of enemies falling per second was certainly terrifying. At least 13,000 goblins and sea beasts were losing their lives on average. This meant that more than 700,000 enemies were falling for every passing minute. The war had already been going on for 30 minutes, which meant that during this period of time, there were about 20 million enemies who had died. Even in the open field, the blood flowed like roaring rivers. The incomplete corpses along with fragments of flesh joined together to give rise to mountains outside the east wall of the base, and no matter where one looked one would definitely see at least one arm or leg lying on the ground. The problem was that the goblins seemed to have decreased in numbers, but the sea creatures seemed to have no end as they came from the distant horizon. Damn it, how many soldiers does this brother of yours have? Bai Zemin couldn't help but curse under his breath. I told you. Xian Meier shrugged her shoulders. No one knows how big the army of the third prince is. The truth is that even my father no longer dares to challenge my big brother Xian Kuan. Sea creatures did not have such a monstrously high reproduction rate compared to goblins, but they could still reproduce way faster than humans and most land creatures. A single fish was capable of setting thousands of eggs, and in a short time, those thousands would become thousands of soldiers. However, for a test raid this was simply insane in Bai Zemin's eyes. It was at that moment that, for the first time, an enemy managed to break through the defenses and rush towards the wall with bloodshot eyes. The first order swordfish had a fierce expression as it looked at the terrified soldier who did not expect the sudden assault at all, but before the soldier lost his life, the swordfish's body swelled up like a balloon in full ascent and exploded noisily, spraying hot blood on the face of the soldier who with weak legs fell on his butt in lingering fear. Xian Meier looked at Bai Zemin out of the corner of her eye but said nothing despite the slight surprise she felt, surprise which increased when she saw that Bai Zemin had not even looked at the swordfish and his expression remained as indifferent as before. That first time was only the beginning of many. In a short span of 5 minutes, more than 10,000 enemies managed to break through the defenses of the human soul evolvers, and 2 minutes later, the first man lost his life after being decapitated. This man had died despite being a level 30 soul evolver, and had been decapitated by a level 22 goblin. They're running out of stamina. Xietain Mayer remarked with interest to see the reaction of the man standing next to her. Of course. They'd been fighting for almost 40 minutes against thousands of enemies at the same time without even getting a split second to rest. Xietain replied in a cold voice, even a machine would tire under such circumstances, not to mention living beings. In reality, they had all reached rock bottom several minutes ago. They were simply pushing each other as the ferocity of the leaders had affected the combat style they fought with, leaders who had been affected by Xietan's practically maniacal combat style. All first-order soul evolvers, retreat to the walls. Gunners, give them cover as they retreat, Xietain ordered in a deep voice. At the end of the day, he had no plans to let his people die in this place. Soon, and under the intense fire of thousands of laser beams, all the soul evolvers retreated to the base safely. Some of them simply collapsed on the ground, fainting from both pain and exhaustion with scratch and bite wounds all over. 10 soul evolvers with healing skills stepped forward and immediately began to work together with a team of medics. On the other hand, the war continued its course, but the pressure on Fu Xietain and the others increased by astronomical amounts after losing the support of the rest. 20 minutes later, something that practically set the seal on the current situation occurred. Leader Xietain looked at the soldier who was staring at him with a pale face and calmly asked, "What's wrong?" The electromagnetic rifles overheated. If we don't stop firing they will be destroyed, but I'm afraid if we stop the fire. The meaning was more than clear. The electromagnetic rifles with unclassified soul stones could take out one unclassified enemy per shot if the soldier hit the right spot. With approximately 7,000 electromagnetic rifles firing practically at the same time, at least 1,000 to 2,000 goblins or sea beasts would fall per second. In fact, it was the electromagnetic rifles, the ones that had been supporting 40% of the war. Without them, it would be difficult to continue now that the human troops had retreated. However, Xietan's response left the soldier dumbfounded. "I see. In that case, have them stop shooting and rest." This? The soldier gulped audibly as he heard his order. His eyes looked out over the battlefield, and even though he couldn't see them he knew that amidst the seemingly endless sea of enemies, there were allies still fighting bravely. Leader Commander Fu and them, do as I say. Xietain casually dismissed him. Roger. The soldier had no choice but to obey, so after one last look at the hell beyond the walls, he left. "Hopefully, you really do have the power to take this base on your own," Xietain Mayer commented calmly after the soldier left. She looked towards the horizon, sensing dozens of second-order ores approaching. "Otherwise, I'm afraid it will be difficult for us to hold the fort tonight." Xietain said nothing and continued to watch the battle with coldness. Of course, with the electromagnetic rifles and all the first-order soul evolvers out of the battle, the pressure on Xietain increased tremendously. Tens of thousands of enemies jumped towards the walls, but none of them succeeded. Those closest to Xietain exploded into a bloody mist, and under the power of the skill blood manipulation along with his terrifying magic power that blood mist swept those farther away, turning all the enemies within the mist into dried mummies that were nothing but skin and bone. At this point, the 2 female third-order tritons responsible to protect Xietain Mayer had already discarded all contempt for the human man in front of them. Regardless of everything else, being able to take down tens of thousands of enemies at the same time by himself, without falling short of mana, was an impressive feat. This was the first time they had seen a first-order soul evolver successfully doing such a thing. The pressure on Fu Xietain and the others had increased so much that even they, elite soul evolvers among the elite, had no choice but to give their all to avoid getting hurt. With the appearance of second-order enemies, different levels of wounds gradually began to appear on their bodies as the speed at which they killed began to decline. The number of 13,000 enemies killed per second dropped when the first-order soul evolvers retreated, and that number dropped even more when the electromagnetic rifles ceased firing. Fu Xiefeng had just killed a second-order shark man when a grimace of pain crossed his face. He looked at the bloody wound on his abdomen and a fierce lightning flash shone in his usually timid eyes. However, before he could do anything, a calm voice sounded from the high wall behind him. Xiefeng, step back. He looked back in surprise even as he hacked his enemies to pieces and said loudly, I still back. Hearing Bai Zemin's firm voice, Fu Xiefeng gritted his teeth angrily, not at Bai Zemin and his order but at himself and his own lack of power. I understand. Fu Xiefeng was the first to leave, then it was Luo Ning, minutes later Nangong Yi, Xiao Xiao, and Nangong Lingxin. 2 hours later, the only existence still fighting was Evangeline, who despite being surrounded by enemies had yet to receive even a scratch. Most surprising of all was that except for her slightly altered breathing she did not seem to be tired at all, slaughtering thousands with her dagger just like before. She was, at the end of the day, one of the most powerful soul evolvers in the faction. Being an agility and stamina type soul evolver, Evangeline could fight for hours even without anyone's support. This woman is truly impressive. Xian Meier praised with honesty. Because Evangeline fought in the south and this was the first time she came to the north, the two had never fought on the same battlefield, so only now did Xian Meier see her in action. Leaving Kong Jun aside, only that female named Feng Tianwu is more capable than her. Feng Tianwu? Bai Zemin looked at her in surprise. Is she more capable than Evangeline? Xian Meier looked at him with a strange expression as she slowly said, if it comes to physical prowess, this Evangeline woman is incomparable. But, when it comes to purely destructive power, Feng Tianwu is even stronger than me. You didn't know that? Bai Zemin shook his head. Although he knew that Feng Tianwu was powerful and talented, he did not expect Xian Meier to hold her in such high esteem. Xian Meier looked towards the battlefield and said indifferently, in a 1-versus-1 battle between this blonde woman and her, I'm afraid this woman would only have a chance to kill her if she managed to take her by surprise. If Feng Tianwu were here, probably half of all these creatures would disappear first before she would run out of mana. Her fire skills are really powerful, although they consume a lot of mana. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. C. 953, a second mysterious pagoda appears. Chapter 953, a second mysterious pagoda appears. Bai Zemin felt a bit of curiosity in his heart after hearing the words uttered by Xian Meier. His curiosity was not specifically directed towards Feng Tianwu as a person, but rather towards her magical power and skills in general, of course. Basically, Bai Zemin was curious about her strength as a soul evolver, simple as that. As for romantic matters, Bai Zemin had long since stopped thinking of Feng Tianwu in that way. In his eyes, she was no different from Nangong Lingxin. No. On second thought, he trusted in Nangong Lingxin much more. Be that as it may, Bai Zemin knew that this was not the time to think about anything other than dealing with the ongoing problem, so the whole Feng Tianwu thing was soon pushed to the back of his mind again, back to where it belonged. I guess I'll have to take care of this myself. Xian Meier looked at him curiously as he took a step forward and her blue eyes twinkled slightly. Aside from Xian Meier, Fu Xiefeng and the rest also immediately focused on Bai Zemin's back. Man, somehow I'm curious to see how strong he has become. Nangong Yi muttered in a tired voice. Indeed. Nangong Lingxin nodded. She frowned slightly and said in a low voice, I'm sure if it's him he'll be able to kill millions in a few hours, but unless his power has doubled or even tripled compared to his 6 months ago self, it's hard for me to imagine how he could take down all these enemies. Everyone knew that Bai Zemin was powerful enough to wipe out millions of enemies on his own. However, just as was the case during the Goblin invasion several months ago when Earth evolved, even he was limited when it came to an overwhelming number of enemies with no apparent end in sight. Besides, the leader is still in the First Order even after all this time. Fu Xiefeng sighed. Just how insane are his evolution requirements? Even with his strength, he hasn't been able to advance so far. Actually, normally all soul evolvers in the universe were supposed to need many months and even many years to complete their different evolution requirements. It was not supposed that in a matter of just under 1 year an existence could go from being a weak human to a third-order soul evolver. However, the earth was cloaked in a great layer of mysteries that everyone did not know, was there, not to mention knowing what those mysteries surrounding them were. To Fu Xietain and the rest, the life they were living now was something that could be called normal, but they had no idea that in the eyes of every other living being in the universe, the life they were living was far from normal. Big Brother will certainly wipe out all the enemies, Luoning said in a firm voice. Nangong Lingxin and the other adults exchanged glances, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Luoning's confidence was practically blind at this point. Regardless of what the others thought, what Bai Zemin had to do had not changed. He had to kill his enemies. That was all. It had been that way since the beginning, since he killed that mutant bee almost a year ago. He kicked the stone wall and in an instant he soared into the sky. As the world's gravity began to pull him back to solid ground, Bai Zemin activated gravity manipulation to decrease the natural pulling power and thus slowing his speed of descent as he watched the endless ocean of sea creatures arriving from the distance. Where the hell are all these sea creatures coming from? He said with a frown. Looks like you're not the only one with a pagoda in this world anymore. Swoosh. Lilith suddenly appeared next to Bai Zemin, uniquely visible to him. What? He looked at her in surprise, before looking into the distance again. I thought those things were really hard to obtain? How did a second one suddenly appear in such a short time? The sea creatures and the few goblins left alive tried to reach the walls of the mother fortress, but none of them made it too far. The battlefield was covered in blood. There was practically no place on Earth for tens of miles that wasn't covered in at least a thin layer of viscous liquid, creating hundreds of thousands of blood threads that cut the bodies of the enemies into pieces. Was not a challenge for the present Bai Zemin. After digesting part of the memories of his life inside that 10,000-year illusion, Bai Zemin's proficiency in using blood manipulation had increased so much that his mana consumption was miserably low. Of course, he had still had to invest over 400 points to create so many blood threads, but in comparison to the large-scale massacre, those 400 points of mana were insignificant. No, this case is different from yours, Lilith said in a serious voice as she looked off into the distance. What do you mean? He asked with a deep frown. A pagoda was no small thing. Bai Zemin knew how terrifying the power of those things was, therefore, he couldn't be careless if someone that clearly didn't have good intentions towards him or his faction had suddenly appeared with a pagoda. That pagoda. I can't be sure since I haven't touched it in contrast to yours, but that pagoda is very old, Lilith said with obvious confusion in her voice. You. How old is this world approximately? Bai Zemin didn't know why she would ask such a question, but still answered in a serious voice. According to various studies, our Earth should be around 4.5 billion years old. 4.5 billion years. She muttered with an increasingly frown. That pagoda seems to be as old as the world itself. What? Bai Zemin's eyes widened. You're telling me that? Suddenly, and remembering the existence of the ancient ruins and King Kong, Bai Zemin stopped before finishing his words. Be that as it may, it's impossible to know for now. Lilith shook her head without lingering any longer on the matter of the age of the pagoda and the earth. This world was simply a mysterious mess after all. She looked at Bai Zemin and said in a serious voice, Zemin, your pagoda seems to be able to restore the deepest records of a living being's soul as long as you invest the right amount of soul stones. The pagoda of the other side seems to work with soul stones as well, but its power seems to be close to the opposite of yours. However, I'm not too sure about this. I could be wrong, so keep that in mind. If Bai Zemin's pagoda could restore the deeper records and the enemy's pagoda apparently did the opposite, modify the deeper records to the owner's liking? He muttered before nodding. It seems the other party found the pagoda, but none of that matters now. Now that Bai Zemin had found the existence of an additional pagoda, he was going to take it for himself. Besides, since the other side was his enemy, there was no need to hold back or be merciful at all. The power of the pagodas was certainly terrifying, but they were not invincible powers. At least not from Baizemin's point of view. Little fire, take all my mana. Baizemin raised his hand to the sky and from his palm, a small deep blue fireball began to slowly rise. The deep blue fireball was only the size of a basketball, but after rising about 100 meters above Baizemin, it suddenly began to shoot fire arrows numbering tens of thousands per second. Boom. 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 Fire arrows rained down on the battlefield at lightning speed, and when a sea beast was hit it was incinerated in that very second. However, the most terrifying thing of all was that after turning the enemy to ashes, the flames that made up each fire arrow did not die out but began to sweep across the battlefield with mind-boggling ferocity. Despite wiping out the lives of around 80,000 unclassified enemies and hundreds of First Order in just an instant, Baizemin did not seem satisfied. He stretched his left hand forward and his cold voice spread far and wide. Blood sword overflow. Consuming around 1,000 mana points in an instant, Baizemin's face turned pale and due to the constant fierce consumption of the endless blue lotus flame, he was forced to activate overlap regeneration to recover. However, the fierce consumption of mana certainly paid off. The blood grew stronger and soared into the sky, forming a huge globe not dissimilar to a crimson moon beyond the sparse clouds. Under the shocked eyes of the soldiers, soul evolvers, and Baizemin's closest team, tens of thousands of blood swords began to rain down from the sky at speeds difficult to track with the naked eye. Explosions of fire arrows and blood swords clustered together as the battlefield became a living hell for the enemy, causing the earth to rumble louder and louder. 200.000, 400.000, 600.000, 800.000. This? Nangong Lingxin watched the scene in front of her with her eyes wide open. For the first time since the battle had begun, the slaughtering speed had surpassed the speed at which the enemies arrived at a far higher speed. In fact, it wasn't more than a few minutes before practically all of the living beings in front of them disappeared. Nangong Yi sucked in a breath of cold air as he watched the sea of roaring blue flames mercilessly incinerating everything. He knew this was one of Baizemin's skills, but that thing was not this strong in the past. How many had he killed already? The pupils of Xian Meier trembled violently as her arms that had been crossed under her chest slowly fell to either side of her body. She looked at the scene before her with her mouth slightly open as she muttered in a low voice words that even the two female Tritons standing a step behind could not hear. This? Impossible. One of the female Tritons cried out in disbelief even though the reality was right before her eyes. That human. It must be a lie. I refuse to believe that someone who is First Order could do this. The other female Triton repeatedly shook her head as she subconsciously took half a step back. Huh. Shirleen's father is Shirleen's father after all. Bai Shirlin nodded with both hands on her slender waist as she watched her father's figure being evolved by the golden halo of overlap regeneration. In Bai Shirleen's eyes, Baizemin was invincible. In the girl's heart, regardless of quantity or quality, her father was the almighty god capable of easily wiping out the opposition. Fu Xiefeng forced a smile and said bitterly, I thought I had become a little stronger and could help the leader a little more. But it seems he has become even stronger and without even upgrading a single level in the process. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse c. 954, Mysterious Fourth Order. Chapter 954, Mysterious Fourth Order. Hearing Fu Xiefeng's words, Nangong Lingxin also smiled bitterly as she shook her head slightly with her eyes still fixed on that figure standing in the sky. This scene reminded her of the past. Back then, Nangong Lingxin was fleeing with her older brother and her gunshot-wounded father while a team of powerful soul evolvers were chasing them with guns. It was Baizemin's team who saved them from danger. but it was not until 2 weeks later that she met for the first time with the mysterious leader who was supposedly recovering from serious injuries after fighting to the death against a powerful enemy. Regardless of how powerful she was now or how powerful she would become in the future, Nangong Lingxin would never in her life forget how that young man, who was probably no more than 20 years old, completely crushed one of the most powerful soul squads of the faction she once belonged to. The sight of Bai Zemin waving his hands and making hundreds of crimson spears rain down from the sky would forever remain etched in her memory. However, what was before her was something that went far beyond that. It was a completely different scale, to the point where even comparing the two scenes was ridiculous. In the end, she simply sat on the edge of the wall and looked off into the distance as she said in relief, "You know, I feel like the best decision I ever made in my life was choosing to be loyal to this man." Nangong Yi nodded with a serious expression on his face. He thought the same as his younger sister. At the end of the day, what we have to do has not changed. Just follow in his footsteps, he will take us far, for sure. In the sky, Bai Zemin maintained an indifferent expression as he crushed the enemy army, an army which no longer seemed endless at all. Lilith stared at him for a while before asking, "Zemin, are you okay?" His lips curved upward slightly in a wry smile as he muttered under his breath, "Seems like I can't fool you, huh? You've been using overlap regeneration practically non-stop for the last few minutes. I can feel hundreds of mana points being drained from your body for every second that passes," she said in a serious voice. Lilith looked at the blazing hell of fire and blood before her before she slowly remarked, "Besides this level of destruction and speed of slaughter." She said nothing more, but Bai Zemin thought he knew what she meant. Maybe, just maybe, when it came to destruction and slaughtering capability, Bai Zemin was no longer in the lower existence realm. This did not mean that he was equal to a higher existence, of course. It was more about Bai Zemin being in a completely different scale than the scale he was put in. Even though he was only a first-order soul evolver, Lilith felt that the two words lower existence were disrespectful to Bai Zemin, even though such words were never meant to offend. "I think there should be some middle category for you, little brother Zemin." Lilith sighed. "Well, if possible, I hope I don't have to do something like this ever again," Bai Zemin whispered in a weak voice as his face slowly began to fill with beads of sweat. He had killed at least 700,000 million lives in a matter of minutes, and while Bai Zemin didn't mind the overwhelming amount of records entering his soul, the problem was that the consumption was unhealthy, to say the least. Even he who had a large mana reserve and counted with the skill overlap regeneration could not take it anymore. However, Bai Zemin gritted his teeth and endured, because he knew he was being watched. His danger sense skill had been warning him all this time about mortal danger, something that could threaten his life under the effect of 2 triggers of Blood Berserker's Wrath skill in conjunction with overlap regeneration. 4th order. He couldn't show his current weakened state or he would definitely end up being killed, many kilometers in the distance, far away from the battlefield. This is just absurd. A soft and lazy voice, but at the same time filled with murderous intent, rang out amidst the silent darkness. Xietain, 3rd Prince of the Eastern Sea, stared into the distance while holding a black spyglass with golden runes in front of his right eye. He was still smiling as always, but his gentle smile contained a hint of coldness that made Krare, the leader of the goblin race, shudder as he stared at the blue dot representing the hellfire in the distance, with terror-filled eyes. Xietain continued to look at the golden figure in the sky towering over the world like an almighty god, and slowly said, "Lord Tao Ji, can you kill that human? At this rate, he will become a major obstacle. More than he already is, that is." A figure wrapped in a black cloak watched everything that was happening in the distance through a glowing magic circle before him. The only thing visible on his body was his right hand, which was not unlike that of a monster with long black claws and covered in scales as he held a long sky-colored scepter with a light green stone on top. This was precisely Lord Tao Ji that Xietain was speaking to and his greatest trump card. Lord Tao Ji narrowed his eyes as his reptilian-like eyes stared at the human's face in the distance. After about 1 or 2 minutes, he turned around and said in a hoarse voice, "Let's return." Xietain frowned slightly, but the smile on his face remained as he stared through the spyglass. "Lord Taoji, could it be that that human is stronger than you? Because if that's the case, I'm afraid we're in trouble." "No, that human can probably fight a level 220 or 234th order, which is quite shocking, considering he's at level 50. Replied Lord Taoji without looking back and slowly walking away. "I have 100% confidence in killing him, but the laws of Earth will be torn to shreds if he and I clash now. This world is not as strong as it used to be, I've told you 100 times. We need to prepare something first." If Xietain were here and heard this Lord Taoji's words, he would certainly be greatly surprised, as his combat power had been discovered almost with frightening accuracy. Xietain said nothing but just stared intently at Xietain. Finally, he chuckled and nodded. "I see. Understand." He put away the spyglass and looked at Crare with a smile. "Goblin leader Crare, this is how things are now. Remember, you owe me 2 million First Order soul stones." Crare clenched his fists to the point where his fingernails dug into his palms as he stared into the distance, with bloodshot eyes. Xietain snorted and turned to walk away. His mood was gloomy, to say the least. He had just spent an exorbitant amount of unclassified soul stones, a good portion of the treasure he had discovered months ago. If it weren't for the fact that he had been used to not letting his emotions get the better of him from a young age, he definitely wouldn't be taking this quietly. Xianquan's eyes flashed viciously, and he was already planning to have some fun with a few human beauties before eating them to ease some of the anger in his heart. Soon, the three figures disappeared amidst the snow, now almost completely melted due to the heat of the blue flame still glowing in the distance. "It's gone." Xietain sighed in relief as his danger sense skill stopped warning him of any kind of danger. Lilith, that was next to him, also sighed in relief before looking at him and saying, "Xietain, you need to rest and recover quickly. Try not to do this again unless it is strictly necessary, understood?" Xietain nodded with his face becoming paler and paler. "I am aware of that. Were it not for the fact that he was short-handed and had no choice but to give his all to keep the mother fortress in his power, Xietain would definitely not have made such draining attacks for the sake of finishing off the enemy as quickly as possible. Fighting for hours was not an option at all. With the number of enemies, the war would have stretched for weeks if not months. Besides, Xietain had a hunch that had the other side not known that he could wipe out hundreds of millions in minutes, the enemy would most likely not have retreated but would have pushed even harder in comparison. He took a deep breath and said quietly, "All right." Trying to remain calm and not letting weakness show on his exhausted face, he made his way to the wall again. There was no clapping, no cheering, no shouts of joy, no roaring. Only silence accompanied by the crackling of the blue flames turning the corpses of the goblins to ashes, but sparing the sea beasts that could be consumed. Sometimes, when someone witnessed something that was far beyond their cognitive abilities, the general response would be silence. Xietan's combat boots made a small thud as his feet touched the stone wall. He looked at everyone for a moment before ordering in an indifferent voice, "Take charge of collecting the spoils of war. Xietain, contact Kong Lan and tell her to take charge of starting to move our people to the mother fortress." This? Fu Xietain looked at him in surprise upon hearing his order and said quickly, "Leader, if we do that, the base we currently occupy might fall." Xietain waved his hand and said indifferently, "Let Kong Jun stay behind. He alone is more than capable of guarding that base from any attack from the sea." Even Xietain did not dare to underestimate Kong Jun. He did not believe that a pack of unclassified or first-order sea creatures could present any sort of problem for Kong Jun. "Our Roger." Fu Xietain nodded. He had received healing from a mage, so the wound on his abdomen was much better, since the bleeding had stopped earlier thanks to Xietain. "Nangong Lingxin, take a team of 20,000 men to take care of the sea beast meat." Let me do it." Nangong Lingxin nodded quickly. She didn't think any more enemies would appear after what had just happened to the army they had sent. Xietain looked at Xian Meier silently for a few seconds, and when his blood-red eyes met her beautiful deep blue eyes he noticed that her pupils trembled slightly. He said nothing and stopped looking at her as he walked in her direction. As he passed next to her, Xietain paused for a moment before calmly saying, "Seventh Princess, I guess I haven't disappointed you, have I? I hope you won't disappoint me now. Hopefully, I made an alliance with the right person." The eyelashes of Xietain trembled softly as she heard Xietan's words. She didn't say anything and simply stared off into the distance as she listened to the sound of his footsteps, moving farther and farther away. As for what she was thinking or feeling, only Xietain herself knew. Xietain ignored everything, including the silent atmosphere, and quickly hurried to her father. She took his hand and looked at him with a sweet smile, making him smile gently in response as they walked off. Everyone looked with mixed emotions at the backs of the father-daughter duo until they both jumped off the wall, before both auras disappeared from the world. Nangonglingxin took a deep breath before saying in a firm voice, "Let's get to work. The leader has already given his orders." Among those present were some who had never seen Xietain, let alone seen him in action, and many who, after not seeing him for half a year, seemed to have forgotten the reason why he was their leader. However, a simple action of several minutes was enough to refresh the memories of all those who had their doubts. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse c. 955, Subtle Not So Subtle Change in Their Relationship. Chapter 955, Subtle Not So Subtle Change in Their Relationship. After jumping off the base wall, Xietain didn't wait for his feet to touch the ground, and thanks to his little angel's quick understanding both he and Xietain were soon dragged into the collector's pocket world. Xietain immediately began to sweat bullets, and his face, which previously showed only a little tiredness, became as white as a perfectly white sheet. Xietain also turned slightly pale when she saw her father stagger and hurriedly supported him. "Father, are you well?" she asked in a trembling voice. Seeing her eyes practically covered with crystalline tears, Xietain forced a smile and kissed the top of her head tenderly as he said wearily, "My dear Xietain, father is fine." However, Xietain was no fool, despite being relatively very innocent. "Did the bad guys hurt father?" she asked as she hugged him and looked at him with her big black bright eyes, trembling. That gaze filled with affection, caring, and concern devoid of all evil. Those eyes were eyes that Xietain wanted to protect at any cost. He stroked her hair softly and said in a low voice, "The bad guys couldn't even touch father. Did Xietain forget? Father is just very tired after using a lot of strength to kill all the bad guys quickly." "Really?" Xietain asked, half believing and half doubting. Xietain nodded firmly. "Father just needs to sleep and in a few hours will be good as new." "Okay. What does Xietain want to do?" "Xietain wants to sleep with father." "Okay. Can I join you too?" "Lilith mommy." Hee. Father, mother, and daughter. The small group of three walked towards the house still in the process of being finished with mother and daughter backing the father's tired body, and when the latter touched the bed, his eyes practically closed in an instant. Hearing his soft snoring and seeing his breathing a little heavy, Xietain whispered in wonder, "Lilith mommy, father can really fall asleep very fast." Xietain sometimes needs a long time to be able to sleep and she gets very bored with her eyes closed. Lilith tenderly caressed the little girl's hair and said softly, "I'll take one of Papa's sides. Xietain take the other?" "I'm sure with Dad here Xietain will be able to fall asleep quickly." Lilith and Xietain lay down on the large bed, both taking a place next to Xietain, who slept on his back with traces of sweat occasionally dripping down his face. After tenderly rubbing his face, both Lilith and Xietain joined Xietain, and the two beauties, one big and the other small, fell asleep. Xietain was really mentally and spiritually exhausted. Ending the lives of so many enemies so quickly had put a great burden on his soul, because even though those records had not yet been absorbed since he had reached the limit of the First Order, they were records that were stored in his soul waiting to be digested. Moreover, controlling millions of fire arrows and millions of blood swords was incredibly challenging. A single mistake could lead to an arrow or sword falling into the base, which would certainly have meant a catastrophe taking into account that Xietain was not just any mage, but one with great destructive magical power. Time inside the collector's pocket world passed, just as it did in the outside world. However, the difference at which both time laws ran was very different. Xietain and Lilith woke up after 6 or 7 hours, but seeing that Xietain was still sleeping, the two waved a finger near their lips as if to tell the other not to make noise, which caused both to smile at each other in response. After lying next to him for 1 to 2 hours, Lilith motioned for Xietain to follow her, and soon the two left the house without making a sound. Xietain, do you want to be stronger? Facing the question from Lilith, Xietain nodded with shining eyes and a serious expression on her face. Xietain wants to be stronger. Facing Xiein's enthusiasm, Lilith smiled slightly and nodded calmly. In that case, Lilith Mommy will help you become stronger. And just like that, Xiein's training, in which Lilith was helping her master the control and use of her respective skills that she had started before, resumed, but this time on a much larger scale. Both physical and magic explosions resounded into the collector's pocket world. All sorts of silver-colored ice creations flew everywhere, clashing in the sky with purplish-black ice creations. At the same time, Xiein's small fists, covered by a pair of snow-white gauntlets, showered fiercely on Lilith, who using a white sword blocked all the other party's attacks with ease. If not for Lilith taking Xietain away from the place where the house was located, the whole area would have been destroyed long ago. It was not until 2 days later, approximately 48 hours after falling into a state of deep sleep, that Xietain finally opened his eyes. After remaining silent for several seconds, staring at the ceiling with a blank stare, Xietain slowly sat up while gently rubbing his head. You're finally awake, SN***, relax. Lilith Mommy, who is Mr. SN***, relax? A new title of the father? Looking to the side, Xietain saw Lilith and Xietain sitting on the edge of the bed as they looked at him, with smiling expressions. Xietain grunted softly and let himself fall back onto his back as he said softly, what year is it? The dinosaurs already rule the world again? I feel like I slept for 2 or 3 generations. He. Xietain laughed merrily while Lilith rolled her eyes. You've been out for less than 50 hours in this world, so it's only been about 5 hours outside. Lilith said. Xietain sighed in relief in his heart as he inwardly rejoiced that he had gotten the treasure bed he was currently lying in. Had it not been for the ultra-comfortable super bed, Xietain would have been sleeping a lot longer, at least twice as long. At the end of the day, one of the effects of the bed was to multiply the resting time by 2 in addition to increasing the natural health of everyone resting in it by 200 points. After about another hour, Xietain left the collector's pocket world with Xietain and Lilith following them, invisibly. They both appeared in the same place where they had disappeared, just halfway down from the base wall. However, everyone was still too busy working to worry about anything other than taking care of the bodies of the sea mutant beasts, gathering soul stones, harvesting treasure orbs and skill scrolls in case any had fallen, taking care of the injured, and a lot more. There was so much work to do that even though 5 hours had passed, there was still no sign of finishing anytime soon. As he headed back to the main villa, Xietain estimated that they would probably be stuck here for a few days, unless they were willing to let the food go bad, something that was absolutely impossible. Xietain had a brief meeting with Xietain Mayor a few hours later regarding what to do next, and after he returned to his room, he received a call from Shangguan Bingshui. Luoning is there? She asked. Xietain sat on the edge of the bed and calmly replied, she is here, thank you for sending her. It's nothing. She happened to be at the northern edge of Shaanxi anyway. Luoning was leading the troops in the east, but since Shangguan Bingshui would be in charge of the conquest process together with Wu Yijuan, Xietain asked her to send the girl to Inner Mongolia since he missed her a bit and wanted to make sure she was okay. The girl had missed Xietain so much that she had been sleeping with Nangong Lingxin before the latter had to leave for the north to fight the enemies in Inner Mongolia, making the girl share a room with her older brother since she could not sleep alone. In Bai Zemin's eyes, Luo Ning was no different from his little sister. The two had been through a lot together, considering the circumstances that brought them together. Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui were silent for several seconds, perhaps feeling a bit awkward with what happened before at Bai Zemin's house while they played Dark Room. I will start attacking other bases in 1 week. Shangguan Bing Shui said after a minute of silence. Yiguan and her people will use that time to stabilize some things around here. You should be getting news soon. I see. Bai Zemin replied. After a moment of silence, he added, be careful. I will. Again, the two fell silent again until Bai Zemin took the initiative this time. We captured the mother fortress from the goblins. I did hear something about it. There were several million goblins occupying it, including hundreds of airships, which I captured with the least amount of damage possible. After a moment of silence, Shangguan Bing Shui asked, what about goblin technology? Goblin technology is very advanced. I think they must have good magic engineers. At the very least, I think it's good to assume that for every certain number of goblins there is a certain percentage probability of a genius being born. Those creatures are dangerous, Bai Zemin. Their numbers alone are already a threat, but if we add cutting-edge technology to the equation, things become even worse for us. Bai Zemin's eyes flashed with murderous intent as he said coldly, I will annihilate the goblins until there are none left. Call it genocide or atrocity, I will definitely exterminate them. Did something happen? Hearing the slightly worried voice of Shangguan Bing Shui coming from the ring commander, Bai Zemin hesitated as to whether he should tell her what he had seen or not. However, after some consideration, he realized that there was no need to hide it. Considering that Shangguan Bing Shui had been the main force during the conquest of most of China so far, she definitely had to run into some goblins on her way, even if most of them were centered in Inner Mongolia. Therefore, she had probably seen at least a little bit of how cruel these monsters were. After hearing what Bai Zemin had seen in the mother fortress, Shangguan Bing Shui fell silent for a minute or two, and Bai Zemin guessed that she used that time to calm down a bit. I see. I understand. That was all she said. Shangguan Bing Shui might have somewhat let go of her almost hate-level indifference towards the males thanks to Bai Zemin's existence. However, this did not mean that she viewed them favorably for the most part. What the goblin males had done had certainly touched a nerve in her. Bai Zemin did not tell Shangguan Bing Shui about the existence of a mysterious fourth-order powerhouse that was most likely not the East Sea King to avoid adding pressure on her even more. Even then, he and she chatted for about 40 minutes, mostly with him narrating a bit of what had happened and how he had captured the enemy stronghold together with Bai Shilin. So, I'll be updating you on how things are going here when I have some time. Shangguan Bing Shui said in a low voice. Same here. Bai Zemin nodded despite knowing the other party couldn't see him. I'll let you know if anything big comes up. In that case, goodbye. Goodbye. Be careful. I will. You be careful too. When the golden light of the ring commander went out signaling the end of communication between the two parties, Bai Zemin sighed as he muttered under his breath to himself. Bai Zemin did not consider himself a dense man, let alone an idiot. It was evident to anyone that his relationship with Shangguan Bing Shui had experienced a certain kind of change after the events that happened that night. Whether it's a good change or whether it's a bad change, only time will tell. Bai Zemin sighed again, this time a little heavier than before. Chapter 956, the beginning of the birth of a special gift for her. In order not to waste his time, Bai Zemin returned to the collector's pocket world after he cut off his conversation with Shangguan Bing Shui. It was still early in the morning, the sun had barely risen, so he had a lot of time, considerably free. Because Bai Zemin did not want the little kids to suffer from a drastic change in their personalities and time perceptions, he did not bring Bai Shilin, Xiao Xiao, or Luo Ning with him. In fact, this time Bai Zemin did not even let Lilith follow him, much to the latter's dismay. Why don't you want me to go with you? Lilith asked with wide eyes as she folded her arms and began to gently tap the ground with the toe of her foot. She looked quite a bit like his mother at the moment. Xietain maintained a calm expression on the surface and said calmly, Lilith, we men sometimes need a little private time to relieve ourselves. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Nonsense. Lilith glared at him and snorted. This big sister has taken care of your physical needs practically every night, hasn't she? Can your right hand give you more pleasure than these two treasures of mine? Xietain almost choked on his own saliva and died of suffocation when his eyes were immediately locked on Lilith's hands. More specifically, on her bosom, which seemed to become more prominent as she pushed them up from underneath with her palms. Lilith was clearly aware of the effect she could have on men, and when she saw Xietain almost drooling, she put on a seductive expression as she whispered, Daddy Xietain, don't you want your baby girl to take care of you? I promise to make you see stars if you take me in with you. Brat, this big sister knows you've been hiding something for months now. Lilith snorted in her heart. She was determined to find out his secret at any cost. Unfortunately, Xietain was a resolute man, and although he was quite lustful, he didn't let himself be lured by the succubus charms this time, even though he might regret it later. No. He shook his head like a rattle and stepped back quickly as he looked at her cautiously. Back off, demon. I will not give in to temptation. What? Lilith looked at him dumbfounded, but before she could say more, her eyes widened as she saw Xietain disappear right before her eyes. She could no longer sense his presence at all, which meant that he had entered the collector's pocket world. You won't be able to run away forever, kid. Lilith stomped the ground in frustration and gasped in indignation before disappearing from the scene. Xietain wiped the imaginary sweat from his forehead after escaping the clutches of temptation itself. He slapped his cheeks several times until his face turned slightly red, causing the pain to wake him up a little from the cloud of lust Lilith was slowly dragging him into. All right. Xietain nodded to himself and didn't bother to enter the house when with a wave of his hand several objects appeared in front of him. Work table, chisel, tongs, pliers, and even a furnace. Xietain carefully set up his work tools before taking out an object that had been gathering dust all this time in his storage ring, despite being incredibly precious. Feather of the Frozen End, treasure grade legend. When worn by a bird-like beast or added to a piece of equipment, the effects of the Feather of Frozen End go into immediate effect. Effect: increases the power of ice-type skills by 20% and reduces the mana consumption when activating an ice-type skill by 25%. All stats 200 when the wearer possesses at least 5 ice-type skills. The beautiful sapphire-colored feather had been in Xietain's hands since the moment he managed to kill the legendary P*Chem** and Art** no back in the snowy biome in the dungeon that appeared in Eventide World during the process in which the collector's pocket watch was being formed. The reason why he hadn't touched this feather until now, despite it being an impressive legend-grade treasure, the reason why he hadn't let anyone know about the existence of this treasure. This was all related to the fact that Xietain had decided who would be the owner of this treasure and also the time when he would give it to her. The problem that Xietain had now was a different one. He stared at the small feather while muttering under his breath, should I make a necklace out of it? But a feather necklace could become a problem in the middle of combat. It didn't matter if it was a legend-grade treasure feather or if it was a normal feather. A feather would always be a feather when it came to its ability to cause itchy skin with its touch. Since the crafting of the necklace was out of the question, Xietain did not have many other options. At the end of the day, a feather was not a piece of leather or a piece of metal. It was an object with practically zero capability of being modified. A pendant. Xietain nodded with a serious expression and immediately set to work. The first thing he did was to take out rank 0 metal fragments for practice. He heated to fiery red the metal fragments using the power of the endless blue lotus flame, and immediately after that began the process of hammering. Xietain took his time hammering over 100 different needles, and it wasn't until about 1 hour later that he stopped when he thought he had found the perfect heat point to start with a higher rank metal, as well as the shape he wanted the needle that would pierce the ear of the future owner of the future pendant to have. He was taking this so seriously that he even took 1 full hour to practice everything for the sake of forging a Needle he considered perfect. If it weren't for the existence of the collector's pocket watch and the collector's pocket world, I probably wouldn't be able to be wasting so much time like this, even though the end goal isn't a waste at all. Xietain sighed gratefully. 1 hour here meant 6 minutes in the outside world after all. Xietain took out a piece of rank 4 metal, one of the 3 he had in his possession. These metals had been found in the ruin left behind by the Kong Kingdom of the past. Xietain had been extremely reluctant to even take them out of his storage ring, let alone use them. However, the situation and final objective certainly called for it. Little fire, let's start from the temperature we stopped before, he said as he brought the tongs with the gold-colored piece of metal closer to the furnace where the endless blue lotus flame was burning brightly. The endless blue lotus flame rippled slightly in response as if it was nodding silently as it adjusted its temperature with ease to the point it remembered from all the previous processes. Raise the temperature now, Xietain said in a serious voice. However, he soon realized that he had greatly underestimated the hardness of a rank 4 metal and what it represented. Even after the endless blue lotus flame had been burning for practically 80% of its full power for 20 minutes, the rank 4 metal had barely turned a little red and was still far from the optimum point needed for simpler workability. This made Xietain surprised beyond words as he knew how powerful his little blue flame was at this point. The endless blue lotus flame was at the peak of third-order flames, and it probably wouldn't take more than a few months to evolve into a fourth-order flame at the rate Xietain was feeding it. Little fire, raise the power to 90%. Xietain said in a serious voice. The endless blue lotus flame just obeyed, and soon its flames became brighter than before. If not for the fact that the furnace was made of special materials, probably rank 3 or even higher metals with heat containment capabilities, the entire ground several kilometers around would have caught fire and disappeared in seconds due to the strong power of the endless blue lotus flame. Finally, after raising the power of the endless blue lotus flame by another 5% until it reached 95%, the rank 4 metal began to overheat, and after 15 minutes it reached the maximum point. A little more and it would begin to melt, but this was not what Xietain was looking for. After taking the metal part to the work table, Xietain took the chisel and drew a thin line on one of the corners. Then, he dipped most of the metal into a large basin of cold water which did not evaporate completely right away, as this water had been slightly modified by Wu Yijuan's hydrokinesis skill. Once the only part of the red-hot metal was beyond that thin line, Xietain held onto the metal using a pair of tongs with his left hand while holding his work hammer with his right hand. Clang! Xietain slammed hard on the piece of metal from the side that had regained its natural color, but despite having used practically all of his current strength, he did not achieve his purpose. I don't think you won't break apart. Clang! 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 Xietain hammered ferociously on the piece of metal for several minutes until he finally managed to detach the part he would be using to work with from the rest of the metal he would hopefully not be using. Using the chisel again, Xietain carefully drew several lines on the piece of burning metal. This process took him almost an hour, and the cooling heating process to separate each piece took him more than 2 hours. Once he had approximately 20 different pieces of miniature metal, Xietain picked up one and overheated it before he began to fiercely hammer to mold the metal into the slightly curved needle shape he had achieved earlier while using rank 0 metal to practice. However, after Xietain managed to compress the metal to a certain extent, he soon realized that no matter when he hammered, his strength was no longer enough to compress it further. I can't believe I have to use overlap regeneration for this. Xietain didn't know whether to laugh or cry as his body was enveloped in a halo of golden light and his strength grew more than 900 points after turning his magic into strength. Blacksmithing was a different battlefield, but a battlefield regardless. Clang! 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 Gradually, and to Xietan's great relief, the rank 4 metal began to compress, although very slowly, with each blow of his hammer. Unfortunately, he soon faced the first of many failures he would have during the forging process of the pendant. he had in mind. Ack. Fuck. Bai Zemin growled as he saw the piece of metal split in half. Using too little strength would cause the metal to not mold enough, but using too much strength after a certain level of compression would cause the thin metal piece to be destroyed. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the dot. Website. Despite his frustration, Bai Zemin did not give up but kept that piece of broken metal in his storage ring for future use, before continuing to work on one of the other pieces he had prepared earlier precisely in case something like this happened. After one full day in the collector's pocket world hammering, after a total of 26 failures and using overlap regeneration over and over again, Bai Zemin finally managed to obtain the needle of the pendant. About 30 hours for a needle. Bai Zemin looked at the thin, perfectly golden needle that seemed to shimmer as if surrounded by diamonds with a wry expression on his face. If just the needle took me that long, I don't even want to think about how long the rest of the pendant will take me. Linking chain, ornaments, and finally the setting of the feather of the frozen end. Bai Zemin still had a long process ahead of him. But this is good as well. His eyes flashed with resolve and his lips curved slightly upwards despite his face showing some exhaustion due to the constant use of all his strength along with several activations of overlap regeneration. Only the needle is considered a rank 3 item. I can't wait to finish the accessory and see her face. He giggled happily, just like a small child waiting to see the happy expression on his mother's face after handing over a handmade gift at school for her special day. This pendant was destined to become by far the greatest masterpiece that Bai Zemin would forge for a long time. In fact, this pendant would outperform his current primary weapon and by no small margin, especially after Bai Zemin asked Kali to draw runes on the body of the accessory. Chapter 957 The War for the Total Control of the Country, Part 1. After finishing the forging of what Bai Zemin considered the perfect earring needle after about 30 hours of non-stop work, he stored all his forging tools in his storage ring and took them into the house. More specifically, Bai Zemin took his forging tools to a large basement whose length and width was basically comparable to the entire house. This basement was destined to become his workshop from now on. Bai Zemin would probably never dismantle monsters or do blacksmithing work in the outside world again. Not when in the collector's pocket world he could do everything a lot more efficiently and without so many worries about time running out in the outside world. With this out, I now have a larger amount of space in my storage ring. He nodded in satisfaction as he looked at his now organized tools. Even though the basement still needed to be finished along with the rest of the entire house, something was better than nothing. Instead of putting himself to continue the process of building the house, what Bai Zemin did was to leave the collector's pocket world to check that all was well in the outside world. At the end of the day, although neither he nor anyone else believed that the enemy would launch an attack again, after the crushing defeat they had suffered the previous night, it was impossible to know what the other party was thinking exactly. After all, it was better to be safe than sorry. Fortunately, the worries in Bai Zemin's heart were not fulfilled, and when he returned to his room in the outside world all seemed calm. Bai Zemin went to the east wall of the base and chatted briefly with Nangong Lingxin regarding the meat of the sea creatures. Bai Zemin, I'm afraid we might need about 2 weeks to finish all this. Nangong Lingxin shook her head as she pointed at the towering large mountain of carcasses. Unclassified fish are fine, but when it comes to unclassified crabs and lobsters it takes a few minutes to disassemble the meat shells carefully. Besides, we counted a total of 20,953 relatively healthy first-order carcasses. For those first-order sea creatures, the time needed is even more, not to mention the few second-order ones there are. Bai Zemin rubbed his chin slightly as he frowned, thinking about the current situation. He had expected the whole process to take about 1 week at most, but 2 weeks was a bit much. This won't work. He shook his head and looked off into the distance before calling out loudly, Xietain, come here for a moment. Fu Xietain was helping to give orders and keep watch in case enemies showed up, but when he heard Bai Zemin's voice he immediately said something to the female soul evolver next to him and, without waiting for a reply, he walked towards him. Big brother, Is something wrong? He asked the young assassin in a surprisingly innocent voice. Just like Nangong Lingxin, Fu Xiefeng still treated Bai Zemin in the same manner as in the past when they were in private. Far from feeling annoyed, Bai Zemin felt grateful that at least these not-so-small little things hadn't changed at all. It probably meant that he was doing a good job not only as a leader but also as a friend, even though he didn't have as much free time as he would like. Xiefeng, any news from Kong Lan and the rest? Bai Zemin asked as he pointed ahead. We need manpower here. We are making the soul evolvers work on something that is not their place to begin with. Be sure to tell them all that they will receive a bonus at the end of the month. Moreover, we need to cut the finishing time in half. After all, this was only the first enemy base in Inner Mongolia, even if the mother fortress was in theory one, if not the largest of them all. Big brother, I informed Kong Lan of the situation over here just as you told me to do. Fu Xiefeng explained quickly. Kong Lan said she would finish completely healing Kai Jingyi and Shen Mei by noon today, so I assume it will be a few hours from now. Why don't you try to get in touch with her? You will probably be able to get a clearer update about this. After some thought, Bai Zemin nodded and told Fu Xiefeng to continue doing what he was doing. For his part, he used the commander ring to make contact with Kong Lan. Because all communications used the Sky Destroyer as a super network, Bai Zemin, who possessed the ring with full control of the ship, could communicate at will with anyone he wanted, as long as those people were registered in the computer. Another advantage was that all communications were recorded and could be searched for later playback if they were necessary. While this certainly meant that there was no such thing as 100% privacy, such a level of privacy never existed even before the soul record came to Earth to alter everyone's lives. Besides, as long as one had no dirty marks, there was no need to worry, was there? After a few seconds, Bai Zemin finally connected with Kong Lan's military radio. This is Kong Lan. Her voice sounded firm and much more confident, a stark contrast to her previous reserved and timid self. Kong Lan, this is Bai Zemin. Have you finished the process of healing Kai Jingyi and Shen Mei? He asked quickly. Oh. Leader, it's you. Kong Lan's tone of voice immediately changed to one that was softer, less formal, more respectful, and with a tinge of admiration impossible to hide after she learned that the person on the other end was Bai Zemin. Responding to your question, both Kai Jingyi and Shen Mei are fit to return to the battlefield, but it would probably be a good idea to let both of them rest for 30 hours. Good job, I'll be sure to reward you later. Bai Zemin said happily as he heard that two of his most powerful soul evolvers were ready for combat and their lives were no longer in danger. That's not necessary, this is what I should do after all. Kong Lan replied with a smile on the other end of the line. Bai Zemin's expression turned serious and he asked in a deep voice, Kong Lan, how much time do you need to mobilize both the main combat troops and the secondary combat troops along with the different logistics teams from our base to the mother fortress? I heard something about it from Fu Xiefeng. Kong Lan hesitated for a moment before cautiously saying, Leader, I'm not sure if it's a good idea to mobilize everyone. The resources that are here, there's no need to move the resources, just the main thing. Bai Zemin interrupted her as he knew what she meant. I know that mobilizing over 200,000 men along with a large amount of resources will be a problem, but I only need manpower. Bai Zemin gave a quick summary to Kong Lan of what the situation was like here, and after she got a better view of the big picture her earlier idea changed immediately. I understand. If that's the case, then things are easier for everyone. Kong Lan said with enthusiasm. Leader, I'll get to work right away together with the others. Rest assured, first thing tomorrow morning the northern advance troops of our Transcendent faction will be entering the south gate of the mother fortress. That's the way I like it. Bai Zemin nodded with a smile. After a few more brief words, he cut off communication with Kong Lan to let her work and looked at Nangong Lingxin, who had been waiting and standing beside him all this time. Good news? She asked, although the slight smile at the corner of her lips exposed that she already knew the response after listening to the conversation. Bai Zemin nodded. Nangong Lingxin, I'm sorry to ask this of you, but you'll have to keep working hard until tomorrow dawn. Once Kong Lan and the rest get in the vehicles and head here, it won't take more than a few hours. To get to the mother fortress, she will coordinate with you so you both can put the different logistics teams to work. Nangong Lingxin chuckled and nodded. In that case, I guess I have to keep working hard a little longer. There is no reward for me? I heard that you would reward Kong Lan later. Bai Zemin naturally knew that she was joking, so he had no problem joking a little since he was in a good mood knowing that Kai Jingyi and Shin Mei had practically fully recovered, especially Kai Jingyi, who was one of the closest people to Bai Zemin, leaving aside a small select number of people. How about I double your salary at the end of this month? Nangong Lingxin let out a chuckle and said with a wink, I'll settle for that, though only for now. Bai Zemin shook his head with a wry smile before exchanging a few more words with her and retreating back to the villa. He entered the collector's pocket world again, but this time he took the 3 little girls with him. After spending about 4 hours with them chatting, joking, and helping them train, Bai Zemin began his own training. Still, this time his training was supported by Lilith again as he focused on improving his whip ability. Although Bai Zemin's improvement had been huge, he still had a long way to go, and this was something he had noticed before while breaking ice fragments and dodging Lilith's attacks. Therefore, he devoted himself to training the whip for 3 whole days, and after that, he spent another 3 days sitting under the shade of a tree, carefully attacking the seal on his soul, weakening it, little by little. Of course, during those 6 days, Bai Zemin took some time to send Bai Shilin, Luo Ning, and Xiao Xiao to the outside world repeatedly so as not to affect the minds and hearts of the 3 little girls so much. In addition, he also took some time to sleep and eat properly since his faction was at war, so it was not wise to go to the battlefield weakened, especially considering that there was a powerful and mysterious enemy in the shadows. Living 6 days in the collector's pocket world meant that approximately 14 hours had passed in the outside world, less than a day. Furthermore, since Bai Zemin and the 3 little girls had entered the collector's pocket world shortly after noon, the sun had yet to rise in the outside world for this new day. Despite being almost completely rested, Bai Zemin slept for 4 hours in the outside world, and when his natural clock struck 6 a.m. his eyes opened automatically. He walked to the south wall, where Fu Xiefeng, Nangong Lingxin, Nangong Yi, and Xian Mei were already waiting. Have you been standing here long? Bai Zemin asked as he looked at the 20+ airships flying over the area in search of any enemy visible in the distance. We all just arrived. Xian Mei replied softly as she shook her head, causing her straight deep blue hair to move slightly. The difference we all arrived at is less than a minute. I see. Bai Zemin nodded, but before he could say anything else, his eyes shifted to the south, and even though he still couldn't see anything, he said with a slight smile, the reinforcements are here. Chapter 958 The War for the Total Control of the Country, Part 2. With the arrival of the entire Transcendent faction located in Inner Mongolia, the soul evolvers who had been working on dismantling the bodies of the mutant sea beasts, piercing the heads of hundreds of millions of creatures in search of soul stones, and recovering weapons that could be reused, could finally rest. After the logistics teams in charge of different tasks such as skin/leather/scale dismantling, flesh care, blood care, soul stone care, bone care, among others started to work without delay. All soul evolvers practically went into the dream world as soon as their bodies hit the bed. At the end of the day, and although all the soul evolvers present could be considered elites, they were still human beings who were mentally, spiritually, and physically exhausted after practically no sleep for about 3 whole days following a deadly war that drained them completely. At the main villa, Bai Zemin met with Kai Jingyi and all his trusted generals to have an important meeting regarding the next move they would make. It's good to see that you two are well. Bai Zemin nodded towards Kai Jingyi and Shin Mei. Both women wore tight leather armor that emphasized the curves of their bodies to perfection. Kai Jingyi's body might not be comparable to that of a relatively more mature woman like Shin Mei, but that didn't mean she didn't have a great degree of charm, a charm which increased exponentially with the ever-playful little smile on her face. "It's good to see you back." Kai Jingyi nodded, and that slight playful smile she always displayed in front of both her allies and enemies turned into one of genuine happiness. "Even though all of us could feel that you were alive, it was hard not to worry given the circumstances." Bai Zemin simply gave her a reassuring smile, and just before she said anything else he stepped forward as if he knew not what she had in mind. "We will bring him back, absolutely. It'll take a while, a few years at least. But it's just a matter of continuing to strive for a common goal. Eventually we'll make it, all together as a team." Kai Jingyi was slightly taken aback with her mouth just barely open before she nodded with a smile and slightly moist eyes. "Definitely." There was no need to name names or explain too much. Those closest to Bai Zemin knew perfectly well what he would be going for. Moreover, those people who were close enough to know his goal and understand his words did not doubt at all that someday that currently distant goal would eventually become a reality. Bai Zemin looked at the cunning, intelligent, and beautiful assassin who joined his faction after making a very smart move during the clash of the Transcendent faction and Camp Baiquan. After a brief silence, he said with a faint smile, "Shen Mei, thank you for everything." Shen Mei looked at him a little surprised as she did not expect this kind of words from the young man in front of her. However, she soon understood what was going on. "Leader, I admit that I am a cunning woman and think of my personal benefits first of all," Shen Mei said in a serious voice as she looked him straight in the eyes. "Back then, the reason I allowed Fu Xietain to live even though I had the ability to kill him was so that you would owe me a favor so that I would have a way out in case Baiquan camp lost the war. But, honestly, even I am surprised by what I am about to say." Bai Zemin watched as Shen Mei smiled wryly while shaking her head gently. She continued, "After fighting alongside all of you for so long, after being saved from countless cuts by the soul evolvers of the Blood Spear Legion, that feeling of camaraderie and brotherhood that could never exist in a place like the past Baiquan camp where everyone was looking out for themselves began to grow. Therefore, even though I am still the same cunning Shen Mei as before, I also have decided to give my all for the sake of these people and the home I have come to build." Honestly, Bai Zemin was more than a little surprised to hear these words from Shen Mei. In his eyes, although she was undoubtedly a powerful soul evolver with talent not inferior to Kai Jingyi and great tenacity, Shen Mei was simply too cunning, similar to a snake that could bite its owner at the slightest carelessness or mistake. However, looking at the earnest and honest eyes with which she looked at him, Bai Zemin could say with 99.9% confidence that her words were not just words but her real feelings. "I see." Bai Zemin gently closed his eyes and smiled, "I am glad to hear that you have found your place. I'm glad to know that place is here." Shen Mei chuckled and nodded, "You did a good job, leader. Building a team of people truly willing to throw their lives away for a common good." Just as Bai Zemin's practically suicidal and vicious fighting style had affected the core members of the Transcendent faction, something that had later spread to almost all soul evolvers as they watched the various generals and commanders fight, his tenacity and decisiveness whenever he fought for the faction and its members, also affected people's hearts. At the end of the day, in this kind of world where leaders were cunning and would rather be on the back lines, a leader willing to take the first step and take the first bullet so that others could be ready was always attractive to follow. A few minutes later, a map about 1 meter long and 1 meter wide depicting the territory under Chinese control, prior to the arrival of the Soul Record on Earth, was neatly spread out on the wooden table in the center of the room. Bai Zemin looked at Xian Mei and calmly asked, "Seventh Princess, would you mind doing the honors for us?" Xian Mei looked at him silently before turning her attention to the map on the table as she nodded calmly. She took about 2 minutes during which she was solely and exclusively concerned about looking at the map. During that time, no one interrupted her but waited patiently as they looked at her in silence. Finally, she opened her mouth and said in a melodious voice, "I can't guarantee it with 100% accuracy, but according to the few troops of mine that managed to sneak past the encirclement set by my big brother Xian soldiers, the number of total bases the enemy has is 5. 6 if we include the already taken mother fortress. Bai Zemin and the others listened to the words Xian said as they followed the movements of her elegant, white finger as she pointed out a total of 5 approximate locations within Inner Mongolia. Each of the 5 locations that her fingertip touched had been slightly moistened so that everyone could differentiate those 5 locations from the rest of the map with ease. These are the approximate locations where each base is situated, I'm sure of it. Xian looked Bai Zemin in the eyes and said calmly, although I can point out the approximate location of each base, I want you to keep in mind that I don't know whether the enemy has more than 5 bases or not. The bases I can point out are the ones I know. It will depend on this unknown the time it will take us to annihilate them if we commence attacking. Bai Zemin paused to think as he looked at the 5 points pointed out just now and analyzed her words. After a few minutes of silence, he slowly began to speak. Now that the enemy alliance knows that our faction is determined to attack after taking control over the mother fortress, I think we can expect a significantly stronger resistance when we attack their bases. This is especially true considering the high reproduction rate of the goblins and the large army under the command of 3rd Prince Xian. Bai Zemin knew that the enemy was fully aware of his arrival in Inner Mongolia after his danger sense skill alerted him the night he annihilated the 700 million army. Therefore, since the enemy knew of his power, it was naturally obvious to assume that they would be waiting for him with great resistance. However, even if we know that we will face heavy resistance, there is not much more we can do about it other than attack. Bai Zemin said in a serious voice as he looked at everyone one by one. I don't know anything about the Sea Race army, but everyone here knows how terrifying the goblin reproduction rate is. The longer we take, the worse it will be for us and the more advantageous for them. Defending had always been easier than attacking regardless of whether it was strategy board games, console video games, or real wars. However, things for the attacker became a lot more difficult if the defender had a trump card that forced them to attack, without giving them time to think about their next move. In chess, players usually took their time to make the next move as they needed to somehow anticipate or foresee the enemy's intentions, so in a situation where the attacker had no choice but to move the first piece that came to mind, the chances of the attacker making a mistake were extremely high. Therefore, even though Bai Zemin and the others had all the time in the world theoretically speaking, the high reproduction rate of the goblin race was a threat that forced them to make their next move as soon as possible. In short, whether we like it or not, we have no choice but to attack despite knowing that the enemy will be waiting for us already prepared. Kai Jingyi let out a chuckle and said with a tone of voice that exposed her enthusiasm, isn't it great? This means we'll be able to take them all out way easier now that they've gathered to wait for us. That's a pretty optimistic way of looking at things you've got there. Fu Xiefeng looked at her feeling a bit speechless. Well, be that as it may, we have to attack, so no matter whether we look at it optimistically or pessimistically, what we have to do hasn't changed. Kai Jingyi looked at Bai Zemin with a smile and asked, isn't that right, leader? Bai Zemin chuckled as he heard Kai Jingyi's playful voice and couldn't help but nod as a few of his worries drifted away. Kai Jingyi has every reason on earth, he said in a firm voice, we will attack and destroy them, that's how it's always been. Nothing has changed. Oppose and perish, subdue and prosper. This was one of the mottos of Bai Zemin and thus of the Transcendent faction. However, things would be different this time. As he looked at the 5 points on the map, his eyes flashed with murderous intent. We will attack the nearest enemy base located north of our current location within 5 days. With me in the lead, Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, Kong Lan, Nangong Lingxin, Nangong Yi. You will follow me along with 80% of the soul evolvers we have here. Bai Zemin announced. Shen Mei looked at everyone puzzled when her name wasn't mentioned before asking in a soft voice, this? What about me? Chapter 959 The War for the Total Control of the Country, Part 3. Due to the large amount of meat that needed to be processed, Xietain decided to wait 5 days before launching the next attack against the enemy forces. This was because the various logistical teams were working mostly outside the base walls to save the time it would take to move the bodies into the walls. Although Xietain could use the skill collector's pocket world of the collector's pocket watch to make better use of time in the outside world, he did not want to let the word spread around about his possession of a demigod-grade treasure with such a terrifying skill. At the end of the day, Xietain was still far from being an omniscient being, and the fewer people knowing the secret of the collector's pocket watch, the better things would go for him. Xietain was about to go look for Callie when Xietain stopped him before he left the room. "Can we chat for a minute?" "I'll be brief." Xietain looked at her silently for a moment before nodding. Everyone left the room, leaving Xietain and Xietain behind to talk undisturbed. The future king of the ground and the future queen of the seas. At the very least, that was the plan. After a minute of silence, Xietain calmly explained her situation. "As you may already guess, all this time I have been fighting against my elder brother Xietain since he had his army break into the small territory that was under my control. It's just that the numerical difference in soldiers was abysmal, and now it is even more so." Xietain smiled bitterly and extended both hands outward as if to show her helplessness as she continued her explanation. "After months of constantly fighting and retreating, my troops were finally defeated, so I was forced to retreat my few remaining soldiers to the edge of my territory. Had it not been for the support I received from your faction, it is likely that by now I would have nothing left of what took me so much effort to build." Despite her saying that, Xietain did not feel that Xietain was indebted to him or his faction. Even if he put aside the matter of the alliance, the reality was that were it not for the soldiers under Xietain restraining Xietain and his army, things would be in a much uglier place for him and everyone else. In fact, even now as they chatted, the soldiers of Xietain were the ones supporting the base south of Inner Mongolia from the East Sea. "So, your problem is that you have few soldiers?" Xietain nodded with compression. "In fact, having few soldiers is a problem for me currently. I will probably need some time to recruit more, time which could be shortened infinitely if we manage to defeat my elder brother, the third prince, here in Inner Mongolia." Xietain did not hide her weaknesses at all, even though in theory her relationship with Xietain was fully of mutual benefit, "but I have a much more pressing problem now, and if I can't solve it as soon as possible, I'm afraid my soldiers will desert." "Oh?" Xietain frowned slightly and looked at her with interest, waiting for her next words. Xietain sighed and said helplessly, "As you already well know, we soul evolvers have a great level of appetite that we need to satiate so that the rate at which our body is modified can be maintained without imbalance at a molecular level." Seeing Xietain nod, she continued, "If a first-order soul evolver were to eat meat from an unclassified mutant beast, they would probably have to eat an entire beast per week, being conservative. However, a single piece of meat from a second-order beast could sustain a dozen first-order soul evolvers." Xietain nodded again, in his heart sensing where this conversation was going. "I know our alliance specified that you and your faction would deliver only the corpses of the zombies to me, but the zombies have diminished in numbers and have gathered somewhere unknown. Therefore, my situation is very delicate at the moment." Xietain learned from the mouth of Xietain that the amount of food she had was pitifully low at the moment. "The third prince took away practically all of my territory, so I no longer have an area for my soldiers to hunt small low-level creatures that don't follow anyone's orders to satiate themselves with quantity instead of quality. You also know that I am completely reluctant to use the bodies of my kingdom's sea creatures to feed my people, but the troops under my elder brother Xianquan's control definitely don't belong to our kingdom, so I don't mind using them as food." Xietain explained before sighing. "Unfortunately, the number of enemy bodies is far from sufficient to meet my army's long-term needs. I fear that at this rate I will be facing severe problems within 1 month." Xietain stared at her, and to the surprise of Xietain, he took the initiative without waiting for her to say more. Due to my fire skill, about 70% of the enemy army's bodies were turned into ashes that were already scattered by the wind. Then again, the remaining 30% still amounts to a large sum. He stared into her beautiful blue eyes and said slowly, I can give you all the corpses of the goblin race, even their bones and skins, which can be used to create equipment. I am also willing to give you 15% of the total dead mutant beasts. Xietain Meier's eyes shone like stars in the night sky upon hearing Xietan's words, and in a moment of euphoria, she couldn't help but lean her body forward and take one of his hands between her considerably smaller ones. You mean it? The excitement in her voice was not unlike that of a small child receiving the best gift in the world on Christmas. However, the euphoria of Xietain Meier soon plummeted so quickly that Xietain didn't even have time to feel perplexed at the sudden movement of the mermaid princess. She let go of his hand immediately and leaned back again as she looked at him warily. What do you want? She asked. Xietain Meier was previously a very naive female, but these difficult months that had practically been a living hell had a silver lining since Xietain Meier learned not to trust others so easily, even in those she thought of as her allies. Xietain smiled gratefully at the seventh princess of the Eastern Sea's quick understanding. He was definitely not doing a selfless favor. At the end of the day, just as Xietain Meier had to do everything she could to reinforce her side, Xietain was in the same position. In fact, compared to Xietain Meier, who had a strong base footing from the beginning, it could be said that Xietain always had it harder than her. I am willing to take care of the food problems you have and may have in the short term. I will help you with all my power. Xietain said slowly. He looked into her eyes and said in a deep voice, I only want one thing. If you give me what I want, then you will have what you need. Xietain Meier did not agree immediately. She didn't want to jump into the abyss stupidly, even if it meant having to go through hard times in the near future. Tell me, what do you want first? Depending on what is this thing you're talking about, we might have a deal under seal here, she said. Xietain Meier was certainly aware that she was very beautiful, legendarily beautiful. So much so that she could attract males of any race without even trying. However, she was fully aware that even if her beauty could soften and charm the hearts of countless, the man in front of her would not move the slightest inch even if she undressed in front of him. This was her instinct as a woman. Therefore, Xietain Meier never thought that he could ask for anything physical or sentimental. Indeed, when Xietain told her with a faint smile on his face what he wanted, Xietain Meier was surprised. Of course, it was nothing physical or emotional or anything like that. The reason she was surprised was completely different. Seeing the perplexed and confused expression of the mermaid princess, Xietain frowned slightly but kept the smile on his face as he calmly asked, Is something wrong? If you're not willing, then forget it. No. It's nothing like that. Xietain Meier still looked quite confused as she shook her head. She frowned and said in a serious voice, Xietain, are you sure such a thing does exist? You need to know that as a princess I have access to any place in my kingdom. I was even once in the treasure coil, but I didn't see anything like what you just described. When he heard this, even Xietain couldn't help but feel confused and a little unsure. If even Xietain Meier herself, whose status was not small at all, had not even seen one time that thing. It's down there, in the seas. Lilith's voice sounded confident and sure in Xietan's ears. She looked him in the eyes with a serious expression and assured him, There are many amazing things in the seas of this world, even I wish I could have those things in my power. Were it not that I can't give you that information, I would definitely help you, but this is all I can do for you. That's more than enough. Xietain said with a gentle smile, pointing out to her that her confidently remarking on the existence of that thing was a surprisingly high degree of support. What do you mean? Xietain Meier asked in confusion upon hearing the reassuring words of the man in front of her. It's nothing. He shook his head and said in a serious voice, Do you accept my deal or not? If that thing exists, then it will be mine when we achieve our goal. If that thing doesn't exist, then you can take this deal as a gift from my side and you won't owe me anything. How about that? After thinking about it for about a full minute, Xietain Meier realized that there was no need to overthink it. Such a large object was impossible to hide, so if it really existed she would have seen it a long time ago. Besides, such an object was of no use to someone with a mindset like hers. Therefore, she saw no objection in accepting Xietan's deal. Very well. She nodded and stood gracefully. Xietain Meier extended her right hand toward him in a smooth motion and said in a melodious voice, "I do accept your deal." Xietain looked at the flawless palm in front of him and stood up before gently taking it for a light squeeze. That sealed the deal between the two parties. "Happy to do business with you again, 7th Princess Xietain Meier." Certainly, getting that thing was not going to be easy at all even after getting the approval of Xietain Meier. At the end of the day, Xietain Meier was just another princess of the East Sea. She was far from being the total and absolute queen to make such important decisions. The one who would make the final judgment would probably be the king of the East Sea, or so Xietain thought it was the most reasonable thing to happen. Regardless of anything, however, this was a big step since in the future Xietain could take that thing for himself without having to worry about breaking his long-term alliance with Xietain Meier. Chapter 960 The War for the Total Control of the Country, Part 4. Aren't you afraid that fish princess will betray you later? After leaving the room, Xietain walked through the stupidly long corridors of the villa in search of Callie. Lilith was walking beside him using her sense alteration skill, so Xietain was the only existence able to see her since she wanted it that way. It was precisely she who asked the above question while looking at him with interest. "Leaving aside you, my family, taking out my loyal followers from the list, and not including Bing Shui, Yijuan, Xiao Xiao, Luo Ning, Callie, and the Wen twins." Xietain narrowed his eyes and said in a cold voice, "The next living being on that surprisingly long but at the same time pitifully short list who is least likely to betray me in the entire world is Xietain Meier." "Oh? I'd like to know how you came to that conclusion." Lilith now seemed more interested in his next words. What Xietain had asked Xietain Meier in exchange for helping her solve her current problem and even solve any possible similar problems in the foreseeable term was no small thing in terms of value speaking. That thing was something even Lilith wished she could have, not to mention other lower existences. "The answer to your question is very simple, my little succubus." Xietain had a smile that wasn't a smile on his face as a blue-colored flame flickered within his blood-red eyes. "My flames can overcome any water with ease. Xietain Meier has already seen what I can do if I put my mind to it. It would be stupid of her to betray me after knowing the kind of man I am." "A Lilicon?" In his room, Xietain looked at Callie resting with her back against the rest of the bed, his bed. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the current situation. "I knew it, you are a Lilicon after all." Lilith wiped away her fake tears and said with a fake sorrowful expression on her face, "I knew it was only a matter of time before you brought out your sharp wolf claws. But I didn't expect that the first victim would be little sister, Callie. For heaven's sake." Xietain rolled his eyes and sat at the foot of the bed as he put the earring Callie had modified in his left ear. He wisely said nothing at Lilith's words. That woman would one day be his undoing. Nevertheless, this earring is truly a marvel. "Callie, your ability to comprehend and draw runes is monstrous." Xietain sighed as he looked at the defenseless girl with genuine admiration. Callie was the first existence in the entire universe to get Xietan's admiration in terms of personal ability. This was something that even Lilith had not achieved despite her great power. However, it was no wonder, considering that the modified earring was an item valuable enough to rival a legend. Grade treasure. Unhindered earring dash. Type, accessory. Rank, 4. Magical attack power, 1200. Magical defense, 700. Durability, 3500/3500. Characteristics dash. 1. Allows the user to understand any language on a universal level after spending at least 5 minutes in a different world. The languages learned will remain recorded forever in the user's records up to a maximum of 10 without obstructing master comprehension of any language beyond the 10 recorded. Description: an accessory which was forged by a blacksmith without skill or thought, upon which mid-level runes were drawn several centuries ago. A monstrously talented rune encryptor outdid herself during the modification and addition of runes, creating a godly object whose rank does not live up to its true value because of a useless smith. The eventide earring had now become an object that even the soul record described as godly under the small, pale hands of the physically challenged 15-year-old girl. As the description rightly says, even I didn't expect the earring to end up being so good, Callie said in a flat voice and without any sense of pride. I just wanted an earring that would allow me to understand Earth languages, but it looks like I ended up creating something quite a bit bigger somehow. Xietain gave a wry smile and shook his head at the girl's words. If not for the fact that he knew Callie at least well enough to understand her personality, he might have thought she was boasting. Without another word, Xietain opened a laptop computer and connected an auxiliary line to the device that King Philip D. Gales of the Gales Kingdom had given him before he left Eventide World. Because so much had happened, including the fact that Callie needed the earring to be able to understand the words of this world, Xietain had not had time to pay attention to the small device. There was too much information in the device, so much so that Xietain was sure that on his own he would not finish studying it completely without 1 to 2 years of time. However, this was understandable considering that what was there was the information of an entire world. Information on how to form soul contracts with mutant beasts, detailed steps to build air-powered vehicles that ran on soul stones as the main energy source, energy towers with great attack defense capabilities, energy shields, mana grenades. The more Xietain read, the more his eyes lit up and the more his heart pounded. With this information added to the books his faction had found in the ancient library, the Transcendent faction would be able to make a great technological leap within 1 to 2 years if they worked really hard. Xietain blinked in surprise as he came across a video recorded approximately 1 month before he opened his eyes after falling into a comatose state following his battle to the death against Demon Lord Aargon. Curious, he opened the file and it soon began to play. Princess, are you sure it's recording? Stupid, I told you to hurry. You think recording crystals are cheap? Ha ha ha. Sorry, it's just that my family can't afford one of these so. Gu Lim. Xietain couldn't help but smile as he saw Gu Lim on the screen with Princess Bianca standing not far away. She was looking at him with eyes about to spit flames and gasping in indignation. Ahem. Gu Lim cleared his throat and looked to where the recording crystal was before he began to speak with a smile. Yo, big brother bye. This is super mega ultra giga handsome Gu Lim. I hope you did not forget about me. This guy. Xietain shook his head while chuckling. Super mega ultra giga stupid you should say instead. Princess Bianca snorted. Gu Lim coughed and wisely ignored her before continuing. This video, I'm recording to give you a summary of what happened after you handed me the power of your stats, right after you ended the life of the Demon Lord. I'll be joining the main army to annihilate the demon race, so we probably won't be able to see each other for a while. Although knowing Big Brother bye, you will surely come to the battlefield when you recover, so there's nothing to worry about. A glint of apology shone in Xietan's eyes as he listened to the recording silently. According to Gu Lim's narration, after a fierce battle between him along with the few who then decided to stand with Xietain against those who coveted the demigod-grade treasure, Gu Lim managed to lead everyone to victory thanks to the power of his armor and that of Xietan's all-for-one skill. Even Orc King Zillig and Snake Queen Mei Lin were not spared by Gu Lim. Although they had been allies before, at that time they were mortal enemies, therefore, they were both mercilessly killed. Xietain was not too surprised by this and did not particularly feel anything. Allies who became enemies were enemies who needed to be finished, nothing more and nothing less. It was them or him, and Xietain was not generous or stupid enough to choose them. After explaining everything, or almost everything, Gu Lim lowered his head a little embarrassed and said in a low voice, Big brother bye, I'm sorry. At that time, even though the king of the Lidora kingdom was among the enemy ranks, I couldn't kill him and didn't let the others kill him. King of the Lidora kingdom? Xietain blinked in puzzlement before a glint of understanding shone in his eyes. He looked at the beautiful Princess Bianca, who looked into the crystal with an expression filled with shame and anger as she said softly, "Big brother Xietain, I know my royal father did not do right, and I know it is selfish of me. But, I hope you can spare his life. I am willing to kneel before you and beg if necessary." "Well? He is your father at the end of the day," Xietain whispered softly. "Big brother Bai, the princess will soon take her father's place and become queen of the Lidora kingdom." Gu Lim quickly stepped in trying to help. Although the princess is still very young and her strength is not fully developed, her talent is not bad at all and she will one day break into the Third Order. With the support of King Philip de Gales, Queen Eloise, the princess's father has no choice but to surrender the throne by hook or by crook. Princess Bianca stared at the recording crystal as if looking into Xietan's eyes and held a hand to her heart, before saying in a serious voice, "Big brother Xietain, when the coronation ceremony takes place in the future I will become the youngest queen in the history of the world. Both I and my Lidora kingdom will be willing to listen to you. Just forgive my father. He had limiters put on him, he will not be able to use his full power ever again as punishment." "Girl, who is this big brother you speak of?" Xietain shook his head, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. He was not angry with Gu Lim or Princess Bianca. In the past, he might have been, but slowly, Xietain began to realize some things that his previous self would have overlooked. If instead of killing a weakened enemy who could never get back on his feet he could gain a great ally in exchange for not doing so, then Xietain could also give it a try. "Ah, the crystal is fading. Ah. This is all your fault." Whatever. Princess Bianca looked up at the recording crystal and her face flushed slightly as she shyly said, "I hope to see you again soon." "Oh, big brother Bai. Remember that you still owe me a drinks meeting." Immediately afterwards, the connection seemed to cut out as everything went black and in front of Xietain appeared the option to replay the video he had just watched. What Princess Bianca and Gu Lim surely never thought was that the next time they would see Xietain would not be as soon as they thought. In a fit of anger and fear of what would happen if he continued to be absent, Xietain left Eventide World the very day he opened his eyes after falling into a coma. There were many things that had been left unfinished there, but he could not afford to risk his home. Xietain smiled a little wistfully and said quietly, "See you later." And so, time passed, and the conquest for the country became extremely fierce. With Xietain to the north and Shangguan Bing Shui to the south, the two pushed their forces eastward with overwhelming force, while Wu Yijuan took it upon herself to secure the seized territory with iron hands. Exactly 2 months later, the conquest of China was just around the corner.